On 16th October 1946, Arthur Seyss-Inquart walked to the gallows at Nuremberg Prison. Convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role as Reichskommissar of the Netherlands, his execution marked the end of one of the Third Reich's most notorious administrators. But for his family, the war was only beginning. From the occupied palaces of The Hague to the rubble of post-war Austria, the Seyss-Inquart name became synonymous with occupation, starvation, and deportation. Their story reveals how the children of the Reich's leaders lived in the shadow of crimes they did not commit, but could never escape. Arthur Seyss-Inquart left behind a wife, Gertrude, and 3 children. His eldest son, Richard Seyss-Inquart, was born in 1911 and had served in the Wehrmacht during the war. His daughter, Ingeborg, was born in 1917 and had married an Austrian lawyer before the war ended. The youngest, Dorothea, born in 1921, was barely in her 20s when the Reich collapsed. All 3 children had grown up in comfort, first in Vienna where their father practiced law, then in the Netherlands where he ruled as Hitler's representative from 1940 to 1945. The family had lived in requisitioned estates, attended official functions, and enjoyed privileges built on the suffering of occupied populations. May 1945. The Third Reich had fallen, and its administrators were being hunted across a continent left in ruins. Arthur Seyss-Inquart had fled The Hague as Canadian forces advanced into the Netherlands. On 7 May 1945, British troops arrested him near Hamburg, where he had been attempting to reach the provisional government at Flensburg. His capture was swift and without drama. He surrendered his pistol and identified himself calmly, knowing that escape was impossible. Within hours, he was transferred to Allied custody and moved to a detention facility for high-ranking Nazi officials awaiting trial. For Gertrude and the children, the collapse came even more suddenly. They had remained in the Netherlands through the final winter of the war, a winter marked by the Hunger Winter, the Dutch famine that killed more than 20,000 people. As Reichskommissar, Arthur Seyss-Inquart had enforced policies that diverted food supplies to Germany and blocked relief efforts, policies that turned the Dutch population against him with an intensity few other Nazi officials experienced. When liberation came in early May, the family was no longer safe in The Hague. Gertrude fled with Dorothea toward Germany, hoping to reach relatives in Austria. British forces intercepted them near the Dutch-German border on 10th May 1945. Both were taken into custody and brought to an Allied internment camp in northern Germany. Richard and Ingeborg, who had been in Austria during the final weeks of the war, were detained separately by American forces. Richard was held as a former Wehrmacht officer, part of the standard processing of German military personnel. Ingeborg was questioned because of her father's position, though she was released after a few weeks when investigators determined she had no direct involvement in occupation administration. The family, scattered across detention facilities in Germany and Austria, would not reunite for months. The initial weeks of custody were marked by uncertainty and disorientation. Allied authorities treated the Seyss-Inquart family with a suspicion reserved for dependents of major war criminals, a category that meant constant surveillance and repeated interrogation. Gertrude was moved between 3 different facilities in the first month alone, each transfer designed to prevent her from establishing contact with other detained families or developing relationships with guards who might be sympathetic. The facilities ranged from requisitioned hotels to converted barracks, all with the same basic features: locked doors, military guards, and strict schedules that governed every aspect of daily life. British officers interrogated Gertrude repeatedly, sometimes daily, in sessions that could last several hours. They wanted to know what she had witnessed in the Netherlands, what her husband had told her about his policies, and whether she had any knowledge of hidden assets or documents. The questions were detailed and persistent, often circling back to the same topics with slightly different phrasing to test the consistency of her answers. Officers pressed her on specific events, including the deportation of Dutch Jews that began in the summer of 1942, the suppression of resistance movements through mass arrests and public executions, and the administration of forced labor programs that sent hundreds of thousands of Dutch workers to German factories. Interrogators showed her photographs from the occupation, images of her at official functions, standing beside her husband at ceremonies, attending dinners with SS officers, and visiting administrative offices. They asked her to identify people in the photographs, to recall conversations, to explain what she had known about specific policies. One photograph showed her at a reception in 1943, standing near Hans Albin Rauter, the higher SS and police leader in the Netherlands who had directed much of the occupation's security apparatus. The interrogator asked what they had discussed. Gertrude said she could not remember. The interrogator pressed. She said it had been social conversation, nothing more. Throughout these sessions, Gertrude maintained that she had no involvement in official matters, describing herself as a wife and mother who had accompanied her husband but had no role in governance. She insisted she had not attended policy meetings, had not read official correspondence, and had not been informed of decisions before they were implemented. When asked about the deportations, she said she had known that Jewish families were being moved, but claimed she had been told they were being sent to work camps in the East. When asked about the hunger winter, she said she had been aware of food shortages, but insisted her husband had tried to secure additional supplies from Berlin. Interrogators noted in their reports that her answers were careful and rehearsed, suggesting either genuine ignorance or deliberate evasion. Dorothea, 24 years old and visibly shaken by the collapse, was questioned as well. Investigators wanted to know about the family's lifestyle in The Hague, the parties they attended, the people they associated with, and the conversations she overheard. The interrogations took place in a requisition building near Bremen, where Dorothea had been held since mid-May. Unlike her mother, who maintained composure during questioning, Dorothea appeared emotional and uncertain. She told them she had attended social functions at her father's residence in The Hague, that she had met German officials and Dutch collaborators, and that she had lived in comfort while much of the Dutch population suffered. But she claimed ignorance of her father's specific decisions, insisting that political matters had not been discussed at the dinner table. Interrogators tested this claim by asking her about specific events she would have known about simply from living in the occupied city. They asked about the raids that cleared Jewish neighborhoods in Amsterdam, about the public executions of resistance members that were announced in newspapers, about the visible starvation in the streets during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Dorothea acknowledged that she had been aware of hardship, but said she had not understood the full scope of what was happening. She described a life insulated by privilege, where official cars transported her between residences, where servants prepared meals, and where the war seemed distant despite its proximity. Whether this insulation was genuine or performed remained a question that interrogators could not definitively answer. Allied personnel noted in reports that she appeared genuinely distressed, and that her answers were consistent with someone who had lived in privilege but had avoided direct knowledge of occupation policies. One report described her as cooperative but naive, someone who had benefited from her father's position without engaging with its implications. Another report was more skeptical, noting that a young woman of intelligence living in the center of occupation administration could not have been as unaware as she claims. The truth likely fell somewhere between these assessments. Dorothea had lived in a world shaped by her father's authority, but she had also been trained from childhood not to question that authority or to look too closely at its consequences. The family's internment coincided with preparations for the Nuremberg trials. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was among the 24 major defendants selected for prosecution by the International Military Tribunal. When the trial opened in November 1945, he sat in the dock alongside Göring, Ribbentrop and Keitel, facing charges that included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was extensive. Prosecutors presented documentation of the deportation of more than 100,000 Dutch Jews, the execution of resistance fighters, the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of Dutch workers sent to Germany, and the policies that led to mass starvation during the hunger winter. Gertrude and the children were not charged, but they were questioned as potential witnesses. Allied investigators believed that family members might have information relevant to the trial, particularly regarding Seyss-Inquart's state of mind, his private justifications for his policies, and any communications he had with Berlin. None of the family members were called to testify, but their statements were reviewed by prosecutors. Throughout this period, Gertrude remained in custody at a facility near Nuremberg, close enough to the trial that she could receive updates, but far enough that she had no direct contact with her husband. The trial proceedings were covered extensively in international media, and the Seyss-Inquart name became associated with some of the most damning evidence presented at Nuremberg. Testimony from Dutch witnesses described the brutality of the occupation, the starvation policies, and the deportations. Seyss-Inquart's defense was that he had acted under orders and had tried to moderate the harshest directives from Berlin. The tribunal did not accept this argument. On 1 October 1946, he was found guilty on 3 counts and sentenced to death. 15 days later, he was executed by hanging. His final words reportedly were an acknowledgement of responsibility and a statement that he hoped his death would contribute to reconciliation between Germany and the Netherlands. When news of the execution reached the family, Gertrude was still in Allied custody. Reports indicate that she received the information quietly, without visible reaction, though those who knew her said she had expected the outcome for months. Dorothea, who was with her mother, reportedly wept, but said little. Richard and Ingeborg, who had been released from custody by this time and were living with relatives in Austria, learned of their father's death through newspapers. The family remained divided by geography and circumstance, each member processing the end in isolation. The Nuremberg verdict triggered formal legal proceedings under the Allied Denazification program, a systematic effort to identify, classify, and penalize those who had supported or benefited from the Nazi regime. Gertrude Seyss-Inquart faced a tribunal in Munich in June 1948, more than a year and a half after her husband's execution. The delay was typical of the denazification system, which processed millions of cases and faced constant backlogs. By the time her case reached the tribunal, the initial fervour of Allied prosecution had cooled somewhat. But the tribunal still approached her case with seriousness, given her husband's prominence and his crimes. The tribunal heard evidence over 3 days. Prosecutors presented a detailed account of Gertrude's life during the occupation, drawing on Allied intelligence reports, photographs, witness statements, and documents seized from administrative offices in The Hague. The evidence showed that Gertrude had lived in the former residence of a prominent Dutch industrialist, a mansion that had been requisitioned by the occupation authorities in 1940. She had employed a staff of Dutch servants, attended official dinners with SS leadership, and travelled throughout the occupied Netherlands in official vehicles. Prosecutors argued that she had been fully aware of her husband's role and had lived in luxury built directly on the suffering of the Dutch population. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a guest list from a reception held in October 1942, shortly after the first major wave of Jewish deportations from Amsterdam. The reception, hosted by the Seyss-Inquart family at their residence, had been attended by Hans Albin Rauter, Wilhelm Haster, who directed deportation operations, and several Dutch collaborators who facilitated the seizure of Jewish property. The tribunal pointed to this event as evidence that Gertrude had been embedded in the administrative network of the occupation and could not plausibly claim ignorance of its policies. Gertrude's defense argued that she had no official role, that she had not participated in policy decisions, and that her presence at social functions was purely ceremonial. Her lawyer, an Austrian attorney who specialized in denazification cases, emphasized that there was no evidence she had ever held a title, signed a document, or issued an order. He argued that being married to a war criminal didn't itself constitute a crime, and that the tribunal should distinguish between proximity to power and the exercise of power. He presented character witnesses who testified that Gertrude had been kind to servants, had donated to charities during the pre-war years, and had once intervened to help a Dutch family secure exit papers in 1941. The tribunal was not persuaded. They classified her as a belestet, or major offender, the second most serious category under the denazification system. The classification was based not on direct criminal activity, but on her status as the wife of a convicted war criminal and her visible lifestyle during the occupation. The ruling stated that she had benefited substantially from her husband's position and had failed to distance herself from policies that caused widespread suffering and death. It acknowledged that there was no evidence of direct criminal activity, but it emphasized that the denazification program was designed to address not only perpetrators, but also beneficiaries of the regime. The consequences were severe. Gertrude lost all property rights, including claims to the family's pre-war assets in Austria. She was banned from professional employment in public sectors, prohibited from holding any position in education or media, and restricted in her ability to travel. She also lost any pension claims tied to her husband's former positions. The classification carried social consequences as well. In post-war Austria, those classified as belestate faced public stigma and were often excluded from social and professional networks. Gertrude found herself isolated, living in a small apartment in Vienna that she shared with Dorothea. The apartment was modest, a stark contrast to the estates and official residences she had known during her husband's career. Financial support came primarily from extended family members who had not been implicated in the Nazi regime. Gertrude's appeals of the classification were denied in 1949 and again in 1951. It was not until the mid-1950s, when denazification enforcement began to relax, that some restrictions were lifted. Dorothea, the youngest child, faced a different challenge. She'd been in her early 20s during the final years of the war, old enough to be associated with the family name, but young enough that she had not held any official position. Denazification tribunals did not classify her as a major offender, but she was categorized as a Mitläuferin, or follower, a designation that carried lighter penalties but still imposed restrictions on employment and travel. The classification reflected the perception that she had benefited from her father's position without actively participating in the regime's crimes. Life in post-war Vienna was difficult for both women, a daily struggle against poverty, stigma, and isolation. The city was divided into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, each with its own administration and regulations. The Seyss-Inquart name was known across all 4 zones, and it carried weight. When Gertrude and Dorothea walked through the streets, neighbours avoided them. When they entered shops, conversations stopped. When they sought housing, landlords turned them away, citing concerns about other tenants or simply refusing without explanation. The apartment they eventually secured was in a building that had been damaged during bombing raids and had been poorly repaired. It consisted of 2 small rooms, a shared bathroom in the hallway, and minimal heating during the harsh Austrian winters. Employers turned them away as well. Dorothea attempted to find work under her married name, Dorothea von Skrebensky, after marrying an Austrian count in 1947. The marriage had been brief and ended in separation within 2 years, but she retained the name, hoping it would provide distance from her father's legacy. For a time, this strategy worked. She secured a position as a secretary at a small law firm in Vienna's 7th district, a firm that handled routine civil cases and employed fewer than 10 people. She kept to herself, never mentioned her family, and avoided conversations that might reveal her background. For nearly 6 months, she worked without incident. Then a colleague recognized her name during a casual conversation about Austrian nobility. The connection was made, questions were asked, and within a week she was informed that the firm could no longer employ her. The managing partner explained that clients had expressed concern that the firm's reputation could be damaged and that it was best if she found work elsewhere. Dorothea left quietly, and the pattern repeated itself. She found work as a typist at a publishing house, lasted 3 months, and was let go when her background surfaced. She worked briefly as a clerk at a municipal office, but when a newspaper article about denazification cases mentioned her mother's classification, she was asked to resign. By the early 1950s, she had learned to lie on applications, to omit her maiden name entirely, and to move between jobs before questions could be asked. She eventually found stable work as a secretary at a medical practice run by a physician who knew her background but chose not to care, valuing her competence over her history. Gertrude, banned from most professional roles, survived on limited funds and the occasional assistance of relatives. She avoided public appearances and rarely left her apartment. Those who knew her during this period described her as withdrawn and bitter, a woman who had once hosted diplomats and Nazi officials and now lived in near poverty. She never publicly discussed her husband's crimes, never expressed remorse, and never distanced herself from his legacy. In private conversations, she reportedly defended him, insisting that he had been a loyal servant of Germany who had acted in impossible circumstances. Richard Seyss-Inquart, the eldest son, returned to Austria after his release from Allied custody in late 1945. He had served in the Wehrmacht as an officer, reaching the rank of Hauptmann, or captain, but had not been implicated in war crimes or atrocities. His service had been primarily administrative, working in logistics and supply coordination on the Eastern Front. Denazification authorities classified him as a Mitläufer, a designation that reflected his military service but acknowledged the absence of direct involvement in criminal activities. The classification allowed him to re-enter civilian life with fewer restrictions than his mother faced, though he still required approval to pursue higher education and was subject to periodic reviews during the late 1940s. Richard enrolled at the University of Vienna in 1947 to study medicine, a field that appealed to him both for its professional prospects and for its emphasis on science over politics. He was 36 years old, older than most of his classmates, and he kept to himself. He did not participate in student organizations, did not attend social events, and rarely engaged in conversations that extended beyond academic requirements. Professors who taught him later recalled a serious, competent student who completed assignments thoroughly, but never volunteered comments or sought mentorship. He graduated in 1952 and began a residency at a hospital in Graz, where he trained in internal medicine. By the mid-1950s, Richard had established a medical practice in a small town in Styria, a rural province in southeastern Austria. The town had a population of fewer than 3,000 people, most of whom were farmers or worked in local trades. Richard chose the location deliberately. In rural Austria, where social networks were tight but also insular, he could build a reputation based on competence rather than family history. He introduced himself as Dr. Seyss-Inquart, a name that was uncommon but not immediately recognizable in a region where few residents followed national politics or war trials closely. When patients asked about his background, he said he had grown up in Vienna, had served in the war, and had decided to practice medicine in a quieter setting. Most accepted this without further inquiry. Richard adopted a strategy of silence and separation that defined the rest of his life. He rarely discussed his father, avoided media contact entirely, and declined to attend family gatherings where the past might be revisited. When his mother's denazification case was mentioned in newspapers, he did not respond. When Dorothea invited him to Vienna for holidays, he usually declined, citing professional obligations. Colleagues and patients who eventually learned of his family connection described him as professional and distant, a man who had separated himself from his father's legacy through deliberate obscurity and geographic isolation. One former colleague recalled asking him directly about his father in the 1970s. Richard's response was brief. "That was a different time, and I am a different person." He did not elaborate, and the colleague never asked again. Ingeborg, the middle child, had married before the war and had taken her husband's name, which provided a degree of anonymity. She lived in Salzburg with her family and worked as a teacher after the denazification period ended. Unlike Richard, Ingeborg was more willing to discuss her father, though she did so carefully. In private conversations with friends, she acknowledged his role in the occupation, but claimed he had been a product of his time and had acted within the legal frameworks available to him. This defense, common among descendants of Nazi officials, reflected an attempt to humanize her father without directly confronting the scale of his crimes. The divergence in responses among the Seyss-Inquart children mirrored broader patterns in post-war Germany and Austria. Richard chose silence and distance. Ingeborg chose limited defense and reframing. Dorothea, the youngest, oscillated between both strategies, sometimes defending her father in private while publicly avoiding any mention of him. None of the three publicly condemned him, and none participated in the emerging culture of remembrance and reckoning that began to take shape in the 1960s. The 1960s brought renewed attention to Nazi crimes and the role of administrators like Seyss-Inquart. In the Netherlands, historians and survivors began documenting the occupation in detail, and Seyss-Inquart's name appeared repeatedly in accounts of deportations, executions, and starvation policies. Dutch publications described him as one of the most hated figures of the war, a man whose policies had caused suffering on a massive scale. This attention reached Austria, where the family still lived. Journalists sought interviews with Gertrude and the children, but all declined. The family maintained a policy of silence, refusing to engage with media or historians. In 1967, a Dutch historian published a comprehensive study of the occupation that included extensive documentation of Seyss-Inquart's administration. The book was translated into German and received widespread attention in Austria. It included testimonies from survivors, documents from the Nuremberg trials, and analysis of policies that linked Seyss-Inquart directly to the deaths of thousands. The publication reignited debates about Austrian complicity in Nazi crimes, and the Seyss-Inquart family became a focal point of these discussions. Gertrude, by then in her 70s, faced renewed public scrutiny. She continued to refuse interviews and remained in her Vienna apartment, isolated and largely forgotten by a society that had moved on. Dorothea, however, took a different path in later years. In the 1970s, she began attending gatherings of former Nazi families, informal meetings where descendants and widows shared memories and provided mutual support. These gatherings, often held in private homes or small venues, became a space where participants could discuss the past without fear of public judgment. Dorothea was described by attendees as quiet but engaged. someone who listened more than she spoke. She never publicly defended her father, but those who knew her said she never condemned him either. Her participation in these circles reflected a desire for community among people who shared similar experiences of stigma and isolation. Richard, by contrast, avoided any association with these groups. He continued his medical practice and remained distant from family events. His strategy of separation appeared to work. By the 1980s, few of his colleagues or patients knew of his family connection, and he had built a life largely free from the shadow of his father's crimes. When he retired in the early 1990s, he moved to a small village in the Austrian Alps, where he lived quietly until his death in 2003 at age 92. He left no public statements about his father and no memoirs. His children, if any, have remained completely out of public view. Ingeborg died in 1989 in Salzburg. Her obituary made no mention of her father, and her funeral was attended only by immediate family. She had lived a relatively quiet life, teaching and raising her children, and had managed to avoid the intense scrutiny faced by her mother and sister. Her children, like Richard's, have remained anonymous, with no public record of their views on their grandfather's legacy. Gertrude Seyss-Inquart died on 11th of March 1978 in Vienna at age 86. Her death received minimal media coverage. A brief notice in local newspapers that identified her only as the widow of a former Nazi official. She had lived the final years of her life in near isolation, supported financially by relatives and living in the same modest apartment she had occupied since the late 1940s. She was buried in a Vienna cemetery in an unmarked grave, a decision made by the family to avoid vandalism or protests. No public service was held, and attendance was limited to immediate family members. Dorothea outlived her mother by more than 2 decades. She remained in Vienna, living quietly and maintaining her connections with former Nazi families. In the 1990s, she gave a single interview to an Austrian journalist, one of the few times any member of the Seyss-Inquart family spoke publicly about the past. In the interview, she described her father as a complicated man who had tried to do his duty in impossible circumstances. She did not express remorse for his actions, nor did she defend them in detail. When asked about the suffering caused by his policies, she said she understood that many people had died, but insisted that her father had not intended mass suffering. The interview was met with criticism in the Netherlands, where survivors and historians condemned her statements as evasive and insufficient. Dorothea died in 2006 in Vienna at age 85. Her death was noted in Austrian newspapers, and a Dutch publication ran a brief article reminding readers of her father's role in the occupation. She was buried alongside her mother in the unmarked grave, a final act of discretion from a family that had spent 6 decades trying to disappear from public view. The Seyss-Inquart family's story reflects the broader experience of Nazi families in post-war Austria and Germany. Unlike the children of figures like Himmler or Göring, whose names carried immediate recognition, the Seyss-Inquart children navigated a more ambiguous space. Their father had been a major figure, but his crimes were associated with occupation administration, rather than the more visceral horrors of the concentration camps. This distinction, while legally irrelevant at Nuremberg, created social ambiguity in the post-war period. The family faced stigma, but it was not as absolute or enduring as that faced by the families of SS leaders. The divergence in responses among the siblings also highlights the complexity of inherited guilt. Richard chose erasure, Ingeborg chose limited engagement, and Dorothea chose quiet loyalty. None chose public reckoning. This pattern was common among Nazi families, where second-generation descendants often struggled to reconcile personal memory with historical record. The Seyss-Inquart children remembered a father who had been present, authoritative, and in their view, dutiful. They did not witness his crimes directly and were insulated from the consequences of his policies during the war. This distance made it easier to compartmentalize, to separate the private figure from the public record. In the Netherlands, however, the Seyss-Inquart name remains synonymous with the darkest period of Dutch history. Memorials and museums dedicated to the occupation include extensive documentation of his administration. Survivors and their descendants continue to speak about the impact of his policies, particularly the hunger winter and the deportations. Dutch historians regard him as one of the most effective and ruthless occupation administrators of the Nazi regime, a man who implemented orders with precision and showed little resistance to even the most brutal directives from Berlin. The contrast between the Dutch memory and the family's private memory reflects the central challenge of post-war reckoning. For the Dutch, Seyss-Inquart was a symbol of suffering and loss. For his family, he was a husband and father who had served in a position of authority during a catastrophic period. Neither memory is complete without the other, but reconciling them remains impossible. The family's silence, maintained across generations, ensured that their private memories remained just that, private, unexamined, and unintegrated into the broader historical narrative. In recent years, documents related to Seyss-Inquart's administration have continued to emerge from archives in the Netherlands and Germany. These documents reveal the extent of his involvement in occupation policies, including his correspondence with Himmler, his directives on Jewish deportations, and his role in suppressing Dutch resistance. Historians have used these documents to build a more complete picture of his administration, one that leaves little doubt about his central role in some of the occupation's worst atrocities. The Seyss-Inquart family, now represented by third and fourth generation descendants who remain anonymous, has not participated in these historical reassessments. The story of Arthur Seyss-Inquart's family is a story of silence, survival, and the refusal to confront. It is also a story that reveals the limitations of denazification, the persistence of loyalty, and the ways in which historical crimes can be inherited without being acknowledged. The family's strategy of discretion allowed them to rebuild lives in post-war Austria, but it also ensured that they remained disconnected from the broader work of memory and reconciliation. Whether future generations will choose a different path remains an open question, but for now the Seyss-Inquart name lives on primarily in the pages of history, books, and in the memories of those who suffered under the occupation their father administered. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Reinhard Heydrich's Family after WW2 next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more historic weirdos. Thanks for watching,